From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. You know, as we've run through this series about the dramatic period of progressive change in Montana between 1965 and 1980, we've had a roster of rather amazing participants, a number of amazing guests. But we truly have a very, very, very special guest with us today. And that is someone most of us like to call by his first name, Max, but current ambassador to China, Max Baucus, former U.S. Senator from Montana and U.S. Congressman from Montana, Max Baucus, is with us today in our studios. And it's so great to have you here, Max. I'm glad to have you.
Thank you, Evan.
It's really interesting. We all know that Max Baucus was, most Montanans, was 4 years in the House and 36 years in the Senate. But the early Max Baucus played an important role in the period of progressive change that we're covering with the Crucible of Change. You know, you graduated from Helena High School in 1959, so you first went to Carleton, but then went to Stanford right away, and finished up at Stanford, went to Stanford Law, 3 years with the SEC in Washington as an emerging young attorney. Then you decided to come back to Montana, thank God. You know, Montana has a great pull for us when we leave it. You know, it's kind of amazing that way. And you came back at the perfect time, and maybe because of what was happening in Montana with the new Constitutional Convention, the legislature. That's the period we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking today. You have amazing history that's broad all those years, but today we're going to focus on the early Max Baucus and your role in the Crucible of Change. And so when you decided to come back to Montana, was it just the pull of the state, or was it specific to the times, and did you see something going on here you wanted to be part of?
Well, actually, when I worked over at the SEC, I would spend some time going over to the Senate, sit in the Senate gallery and watch debates. And there are a couple debates there that had quite an effect on me. That's when President Nixon nominated a fellow named Carswell, another fellow named Hainsworth to the United States Supreme Court. And frankly, I was quite put out with those nominations because I thought neither of them was really qualified to serve the United States Supreme Court. I had a deep reverence when I was in college, again in college and also in law school, for the Constitution. I just felt that we're so lucky as Americans to have that document, and as it turns out to be the longest democracy in world history. And I did not like to see those two fellows appointed to the Supreme Court, and that kind of got me going a little bit. So that's wrong. You know, maybe I got to do something about that. But actually, before that, the seeds were planted when I went to the college. I went to an overseas campus, and I went to school 6 months in France, and then after that, I realized I had not learned anything. So I was with 80 students in the same building, so I did not learn the language, that's for doggone sure. So I just stayed overseas for another year. I put a knapsack in my back and a little handbag and hitchhiked around the world for a year. And it was during that 1 year that I realized the world's getting smaller, resources are diminishing, and I know that 1 year opened my eyes and planted seeds for later, germinated to a later interest in public service. And so all that kind of accumulated, and so I said, hey, I've been away from home for a long time. I want to go home. I'm a Montanan. All of us Montana, we love our state so much. So I decided I wanted to go home, and I want to go home and serve. I want to do something.
You know, let me pull up a picture here, an earlier picture than this. So this, of course, is early Max Baucus, as many of us remember you. But earlier than that, and relevant to your kind of sense of, is this picture here, which was taken when you were at Boys Nation in 1959?
Yeah, that was the summer of '59, that's right. Yeah, I got back. You know, Montana, every state had a boys state, and I went to Boys State, and they selected 2 to go to Washington, D.C., and the other fellow with me is Larry Short from Billings. And we met Mike and Lee. And
Mike Mansfield was the junior senator then.
That's right.
The senior senator was Senator Murray.
That's correct.
And then Lee Metcalf was still a House member.
That's correct. That's right.
Although soon to be to replace Murray.
That's right.
That must have whetted your appetite a little
bit.
bit.
Well, it did. Yeah, I remember walking into Senator Murray's office. My gosh, a huge, big, thick, red carpet. I mean, he just bounced on his carpet walking across, shake Senator Murray's hand. But also, Mike took me to lunch at the dining room there, and it meant a lot to me to have lunch with Mike Mansfield.
He was an inspiring guy,
and very much for me. Yeah. He's one of my inspirational figures.
So when you talk about being out of state and having that pull to come back, it reminds me of myself when I ended up starting at Montana State, but I ended up at St. John's University in Minnesota. And Minnesota was a wonderful place to be and everything else, and I liked the politics there and everything else, but I looked up and, you know what? No mountains. And I was getting a job, and I thought, this is not for me. I got to get back to Montana. So you were pulled back by the nature of the state, and you arrived just in time, actually, for the Constitutional Convention. Tell us how you heard about that, and then how you ended up getting involved with the Constitutional Convention.
Well, I was pretty excited about the convention. I thought, this is something. This is historic. States don't have Constitution conventions very often, and we in Montana are having one. And it's a great opportunity kind of to write a Constitution somewhat patterned on our federal Constitution. So I want to come back and be part of that. And I went to work for the convention as a staff member, and I specifically worked for Leo Graybill from Great Falls, who was president of the convention. A great guy. I learned a lot from him.
You know, we've heard so much about him in other programs, and all the programs about the Constitutional Convention. Everybody speaks so highly of Leo's leadership of that convention, and both firm but fair, you know, and clearly, I think somewhat with help from, by the way, I think the staff, not just you, but when you look at the staff of that convention, it was pretty amazing group of young people, wasn't it?
I'll tell you, we were blessed. We had, each of the sections of the Constitution had a staff,
right,
and somebody headed up each of the staffs for those sections. The people we had were just aces. They were terrific. I mean, they were some of the smartest, most dedicated younger people I've ever had the opportunity to meet. We're very lucky as Montanans to have them. They helped shape and help write the drafts for each of the various articles of our state constitution, and I can't praise them too much.
You know, a number of them have been on our shows as we dealt with different segments of the Constitution, and when I discovered as I started digging into this thing, I knew a lot of them and I knew how good they were, but they did this preliminary research and wrote it up for the delegates and the committees to look at.
Right.
And so I was pretty amazed when I looked at Bruce Evers had written a 240-page book essentially about education. I thought that was something. And then I looked at what Rick Applegate wrote on the Bill of Rights, and it was a 440-page book that he wrote that everyone could study.
Yeah.
They're brilliant people, and both of those two, by the way, have participated in our filming.
Yeah, they're both very good.
And Rich Bechtel's part of it,
Right.
and Roger Barber's going to be here for part of it, and Jerry Holleran's going to be
Right.
here for part of
Right.
it. And so here you are. You were one of that staff. But you were working directly with Leo to start with, right?
That's right.
You were coordinating committee activity a lot.
Well, that's right. And my job was to kind of help the committees coordinate, work together. And then later on, it turned out that I was the acting executive director of the convention. But basically, I did not do the substantive work.
Right.
The substantive work was done by the Jerry Hollerans, by the Bruce Sievers, and by the Rick Applegates, and others of the committee. They're the ones who really worked hard. And of course, it was delegates themselves who decided which portions to write. But when you stop and think about it, there's no way in the world that Montana could write that Constitution today.
Yeah.
We're in a different era today. It's a different time.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, you could just feel the progressive stirrings. Montana was, delegates sense this is a moment in history, not have this opportunity again, and rose to the occasion and wrote, in my judgment, one of the best constitutions that's been written. Others have tried, other states have tried, but we in Montana did a pretty good job.
You know, everyone pretty much, the scholars included, have said this is probably the best state constitution in America now as a result of that activity. But I like to look at it and think that one of the reasons why there was such an explosion of concern and progressivity was at that time we were just shaking and just getting rid of the copper collar. We'd had 75 years where we were essentially a corporate colony, and it's hard for people today to realize what getting unshackled from that copper collar meant to this state. We had to explode out and do things that involved people. And I think that was a hallmark of your days in politics and your emergence in politics was it was about empowering people. You fit right into that.
Well, you know, that's interesting. There are several provisions in our state's constitution which mean a lot to me. One is our preamble. I think our preamble pretty well.
We did a program on that. Yes.
Really, it's interesting.
Yes.
That doesn't surprise me because the preamble is I think,
beautiful.
It's a central part of our state's constitution and well represents what the Constitution is all about. But in addition, you know, the right to know provision meant a lot to me. I thought that was revolutionary, and I know it's caused a lot of problems for a lot of public officials in our state since then. But it's the right thing to do, so the public has a lot more availability. The environmental article was very strong. But of course, the environment is very deeply enshrined in our state's constitution. But there's a lot of progressive provisions in there that which could not be written today.
We did a program on the preamble and the environmental, which especially focused on that clean and healthful environment language, which was a real struggle to get in even then. And then it's stood the test of time. You know, we looked at all of these particular segments and the people that were participating. It was a pretty amazing story.
And one thing I never forget, it was during the debate on the environmental article. It was one of the delegates,
Robinson then.
Back then it was Robinson, Ellingson later. But Maine Ann Robinson's delegate mentioned, she was very good, she's smart. And she got up and she was strongly advocating for the inclusion of this environmental article in the Constitution. Another delegate stood up and questioned her, debated her. And during his remarks, he said, well, Ms. Robinson, now just what would you do if you wanted to bring environmental action under this Constitution? What would you do? Where would you go? What would you do? And she right away said, well, I'll tell you one thing I would not do. I would not go to you to enforce it. And it brought the House down.
Yeah.
You know, Jim took it very well. And
you know, they said it took 8 votes to get that language in the environmental article. And there's a really interesting story, but I'm not going to reveal it here. We'll ask people to tune into that segment, that episode, because it was a really amazing thing. the people power aspect of this, the open government stuff, we did a program on that with Mike Malloy, and open government, and we're the only state in the nation that has in a constitution the right of citizens to participate in their government. Not just the open meetings, open records, but the right to participate. So how those things, you know, it's interesting when you put real people in a room together.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that happened though is we were in the state. We're pretty smart. I didn't do this, but the state was pretty smart in my judgment. That is, delegates could not be sitting legislators, and second, delegates could not run for the legislature once they served their term. That enabled them to do their work, enabled them to think, okay, what's right for our state? It prevented them from demagoguing. It prevented them from using their position for later political campaigns. In my judgment, it was one of the central reasons why we wrote a good constitution. These are very, very good people, different parts of the state, some liberal, some conservative, but bottom line, they cared about Montana. They cared about Montana. There's another factor here which I think is very helpful. It's the nature of our state. A couple of points here. Number one, someone once coined the expression that Montana is really one big small town. That is very accurate. We are one big small town. We tend to know each other, or about 1 to 2 degrees of separation. That maybe Aunt Helen or Uncle Pete knows somebody in another part of the state, and we tend to know each other, but we're separated in different communities. We may be up on the High Line, we may be down in the Bitterroot, we could be down eastern Montana, southeastern Montana, wherever, but we tend to kind of be together as a state. And I think that separation of different communities where we tend to know each other, tend to know somebody who knows each other, binds us together as a community. And the delegates there knew that, and they took great advantage of that in the best sense of the term. There's something else about our state which I think is very important. That is the size of our state. It's so beautiful. It's so expansive. The sense of space, its sense of empowerment, it's of humility because of the distances in our state, and it enables us when we're together and we were together because those 100 delegates were not former legislators or current legislators, and they couldn't run again, at least for the next couple of years. Enabled them to work together to write a great document.
You know, the way the Supreme Court interpreted that, and they said no sitting legislators could run, and so there were a few of the former legislators, but they couldn't be current. And boy, the legislature was not happy with that, but it was something that really made a big difference, that you had a citizen gathering at that point. Now, one of the things that happened was, and I've heard a lot of different stories about how it happened, but essentially, when they adopted the rules, Leo Graybill advanced a rule that said we would sit alphabetically, not divide down the middle by party like you do in the legislature, but sit alphabetically so that if the person next to you alphabetically was a Republican and you were a Democrat or an independent, didn't matter. That's where you sat, and that's how you worked. What was your perspective on that? Everyone seems to think that made a big difference.
Delegates did not run as partisan candidates anyway.
Oh, they did. No, they did. Yes, they did. Absolutely.
I've forgotten that.
We had 59 Democrats, and we had 6 independents, and we had like 45 Republicans.
No, I think it's smart to be seated alphabetically. Yeah. That's very smart. And that was the sense. There was no sense of partisanship.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
I forgot they ran as partisan candidates, but I'll tell you,
when they got there,
there was no partisanship.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've heard that from everybody we've spoken to. You know, regretfully, right now there's only about 25 of the 100 left, and but they're all very insightful about what went on, and they're such a big part of Montana history. And you were too. I mean, now you were coordinating the committees, but then there was some staff difficulties, some changes in one of the predominant staff people who we all hear so well about. Dale Harris played such a big role, couldn't continue, and you then stepped into the breach, so to speak, to keep that staff moving and keep everything going.
Look, I'm not going to claim credit for writing this Constitution. I helped out. I was more of a facilitator.
Well, a manager.
Yeah, but it was the delegates themselves.
Yeah.
The delegates were the ones who put this together, and I take my hat off to them.
So toward the end of the legislature, toward the end of the Constitutional Convention, which ended in March, was also the filing deadline for the 1972 elections. And you filed at that time for the legislature out of Missoula.
Correct.
You'd moved back to Missoula.
Right.
And,
I was always in Missoula.
You were in Missoula.
When I came back from Washington, D.C., I moved to Missoula.
Right. And you set up a little law practice there,
Right.
and you ran. When you first, now having filed, you went back to Missoula, but helped between March and June.
Right.
In June,
Right.
we had to pass it. It was on the ballot.
Yeah.
You participated a lot in helping promote it in Missoula, didn't you?
I did a bit, but more of it was while the convention was in session. I'd go back to Missoula on weekends, and I'd give a report to Missoulians on KGO, on the major TV station in Missoula. And I just want to explain to Missoula what's going on. It's a public service to explain to Missoulians what we're doing, what's being debated, what the issues are, and so forth, as a way to get people in Missoula, comfortable with what's happening.
Now, it was interesting the role Missoula and other urban counties played, but Missoula in a big way,
Right.
that the Constitution, when it was up in June, won by 2,500 votes. But the margin in Missoula was 6,500 votes. Missoula had 13,271 vote for it, 66% plus, and only 6,700 against it. So there was a 6,500 vote margin in Missoula alone,
Right.
and a statewide margin of 2,500. So you guys in Missoula played a big role in making sure that thing passed.
Yeah, well, it's from my perspective, we're lucky that it did pass.
Yeah.
It made a big difference to the state.
Well, it was close, because the interesting
Right.
thing was when they called the convention, 70% of the people said, yeah, let's have a convention.
Mm-hmm.
When they looked at the results, it was 51% said yes.
Right.
But when you get down to it, the Constitution was really about empowerment of people, as a change from an empowerment of corporations, which was the way the original W.A. Clark created Constitution back in 1889 was more about the mining companies and
Right.
the logging companies and so on.
Right.
So it was a change of power.
Right.
Now, you took a lesson from all that in terms of when you're running for the legislature, because though you were running county-wide in Missoula,
Right.
but before there was even single-member districts.
Back then we in Montana had multi-member districts. That's
Right.
right. Missoula had eight. Eight
that were elected
at large
in the House, yeah.
Right. Right.
And you ran, but you did something most people didn't do. You did door-to-door for the whole county, as much as you could get done.
Right. Missoula's a big county.
Yeah. Did you actually go up to Seeley Lake and hit some bunch of doors up there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
see?
that's Seeley, yeah. Right.
Yeah. So you knocked on all these doors. You were.
Well, it was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. It meant a lot to me if I'm going to hold myself out to potentially represent somebody, whatever body, legislature, wherever, it meant a lot to me to be able to talk to people to find out what's on their minds, so I could do as good a job as possible. Because after all, I'm talking to my potential employers. I'm just the hired hand. I'm just the employee. Voters are the employers, and they're the ones who elect or don't elect me or anybody else. So it meant a lot to me to go out and talk to people individually, and so I did. I went around the county and knocked on doors and asked somebody what's on their mind, introduced myself, and the central question I always ask is there something I should know if I am able to represent you and serve you in Helena? And more often than not, somebody would not have a specific thing to say, but sometimes people would have a lot to say. I also learned a lot and going through all of Missoula County, because Missoula County, there's some wealthier sections and there's some poorer sections. And you go to a poorer section in Missoula County, knock on the door, and often it'd be an elderly woman shut in and just lonely and just kind of down on life, and sit and talk to her. Sometimes it'd be a guy, sit and talk to him. But it opened up my eyes a lot and enabled me to have a better idea if I'm going to aspire to represent Missoula County, to represent my prospective employers. The people of Missoula County gave me a good sense of what's on people's minds. And it enabled me to then act with more confidence when I was in the legislature to vote this way or that way, because I'd talked to Missoulians, I connected with Missoulians. That was very important to me.
Mm-hmm. Now, going to all these doors was basically emblematic of this empowerment of people that we're talking about in this whole period. The change in the Constitution was an empowerment of people. You going and talking to people at their doors was a way that they are empowered.
Right.
And surprisingly, maybe it's because of that, out of those 8 people, how did you do? I mean, you had 16
counties,
running,
counties,
but
yeah.
you had to run, and 8 were emerged. How did you end up?
Well, I did okay.
I heard you get number 1.
Yeah, but it's the main thing is I was just able, since I'd knocked on so many doors in Missoula County, I was able to represent the county with some sense of confidence.
Yeah, well, I think, but it does speak to people responding to being approached at that level, the grassroots level, which again is what this whole period seemed to be about, a disempowerment of the powerful and an empowerment of people. And that's the story of this whole period in a lot of ways. Now, when you went to the legislature, I remember your, when you were running, at that time I was executive director of the Democratic Party. We knew each other a little, somewhat at that time. Right. And I always remember the plaid shirt.
Oh yeah.
You had a look about you which was a real people look. And you went off to Helena and you got engaged in the legislature. Tell me about your, and by the way, the only 2 annual session period we had a 73 session and 74, and you were in both of them. What was what did you think when you got to the legislature, and what did you try to do?
Well, there are a couple of things that were important to me. One is this poll booth registration. I just felt that everybody
booth registration.
I felt that everybody should be able, it didn't make much sense to me that people had to wait, I think it was 40 days, whatever it was, to register to vote. But what if you weren't able to? A person should not be disenfranchised, should not be disallowed the ability to vote just because he or she didn't register in time. So I pushed that, but that didn't get very far, frankly.
But let's think about it now. That's 42 years ago.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
You were way ahead of your time, because that's an issue today. It was an issue in Montana this last year.
It is an issue even around the country in lots of different states. It is today too. Correct.
We just had an initiative in Montana where it was suggested that we get rid of poll booth registration, and the people resoundingly said no.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But you were so ahead of your time on that, and it's a concern. Participation being so, the bedrock of democracy has got to be participation.
Right. Exactly.
And so that was your primary bill,
yeah.
But you also had another one that was a way to make government work for people, and that was an ombudsman bill.
Yeah, I felt, I've forgotten where I got the idea. I felt that somebody should, at various state government agencies, be there to stand up and represent the people. In addition to the, let's say, the department director who theoretically represents the people of our state, there should be somebody also who represents people at a hearing. It might be before that department or agency. It's a concept that's been, I think it was developed in northeastern states. I've forgotten where. No, it was in, I think it was in Europe. But it's, anyway, I felt that was important.
There was I don't remember if it was in the Constitution. I think it is. There was a little tip of the hat toward that a little bit with that thing called the Consumer Council, which was to help represent some folks during utility hearings.
That's right.
But you wanted somebody who could represent people that way, and eventually that, I believe, got melded in a way to the citizens advocate function in the governor's office, which was brand new then under the new governor.
Right.
It's
the same concept.
And the citizens advocate, which started in 1973, is still in place today.
Yeah.
And still to this day, same phone number they had then, and they get thousands and thousands of calls every year of people saying, help me with this problem with government. So again, that was all about people.
Right.
Did your participation in the legislature, 2 terms like that, when did you start thinking maybe Congress might be a good idea?
Well, it was pretty early, actually, during the 2 years in the legislature. I felt that I wanted to represent not only Missoula County, but all of western Montana. Back then, we had 2 congressional districts, not one as we currently have today. And so I wanted to represent more than the county. I like Missoula a lot, but you know, we got Butte in western Montana.
Yeah, yeah.
And you got Helena and Bozeman, other Kalispell, and other cities in the state. I wanted to represent the entire western part of Montana.
So you started thinking early on, but my recollection, by the way, was again in keeping with your sense of empowering people and asking people. You must have had a conversation with half of Western District asking them about what do you think? I remember you coming and you and I sitting underneath the tree in my front yard, and you were saying,
"Oh, yeah.
Evan, I'm thinking about this congressional thing. What do you think about it?"
Yeah.
And I certainly was only one of hundreds that you had to have talked to. Was it partially because they weren't happy with the representation we had with at that time?
No, it wasn't that. I wanted to get people's views, and that's why we talked to a lot of people and asked their opinions generally. It wasn't because I wanted to oppose Dick Shoup. Dick Shoup, who represented western Montana at the time, was a good man. No, it wasn't that. It was just that it's kind of the old thing in life. I think it's important to pursue what you want to do, what you think is most important and most fulfilling for you, rather than trying to beat somebody else. This is what I wanted to do. I wanted to represent western Montana. It wasn't that I wanted to defeat the incumbent. That's irrelevant. I don't care who the incumbent is. It's just that I felt that I could do a very good job representing Montana. So that's why I ran.
Well, you know, that speaks to kind of the way life is in a way. If you're lucky enough to really, really want to do something, and then you get the chance to do it, and by the way, I'm doing this thing I love, and guess what? I even get paid to do it. And it's not that the pay means a thing. What means something is that you're doing what you love.
Yeah, true.
And boy, that gets you up in the morning, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
I think that I know in my life I've always been blessed that almost every day that I got up to go to work, I had something exciting I wanted to do.
That's a good place to be.
You've had that kind of life as well, haven't you?
Well, I don't know. You know, as you get older, you learn a few things, and one is you just do your very best.
Yeah.
You do the best you can with what you got, and just go for it. And basically, in life, we've got 2 choices, as I see it. One is to try. The other choice is do nothing. And to ask the question is to answer it. So, of course, we try. And then once we try, we got another choice, which is do we try our best or not? Of course, we try our best. And most often, I just try to do the best I can with what I got. And a lot of it, too, is just is serving people. I think the most noble human endeavor is service. It's service to church, it's service to synagogue, it's church to family, it's church to community, it's church to friends, to family. It's just or public service. It's just service. And that's what drove me, frankly, when I left Washington, D.C. back around 1970, whatever year it was to serve. I just wanted to serve the people of Montana. And it's, as I stated earlier, I think the seeds were laid much earlier than that, when I was hitchhiked around the world and saw people, met people. And back then I learned that people are the same worldwide, basically. They just want to have a decent income, decent living, take care of their kids, decent health care, decent health. People are alike worldwide. And so I wanted to help make sure that people I lived with, Montanans, got a good break.
Well, you know, and again, our paths are quite different, but I would say that's a common element. because even when I was not in government, although was involved in government for a number of years, and I was in economic development, which is about trying to find economic gain and help for people with jobs and stuff. And so, gosh, I couldn't agree more with you. And I think that there's a real message in your life about service that needs to resonate with young people today. When times are tough, sometimes it's hard to think about that, but serving others is really such a fulfillment that if we can inspire young people to say, one of the first things I want to do is it isn't just about getting that paycheck, it's about, am I making a difference for people?
Right, and at any level. It could just be your spouse. Mm-hmm. It can just be a child that you're helping, you're helping. It can be someone in your neighborhood. It can be any level.
Yeah, and part of the purpose of this series we're doing now is to help convey the message of participation to a new generation of people who aren't familiar with what went on in the 1960s and 1970s, and it's a remarkable story to be told. Now, in your case, you finally decided you were, after talking to all those folks, including me, and asking about should I run for Congress, run may be the wrong word. You decided to go for Congress in the Western District, and you were in a three-way race against the former Congressman, Arnold Olson, against a former legislator and soon-to-be future Congressman, Pat Williams, and yourself. Now, there's three remarkable people, by the way. Three remarkable people.
Well, two of them are.
Yeah, well, you know, and I mean, what an amazing amount of talent to be on the, you know, running at the same time. But you didn't run. You actually, I want to put this up here for folks to see, because you actually walked for Congress. In keeping with your idea of being able to connect with people, you decided to go from Gardner to Yak, was that it? Now, Gardner being what?
Well, down near Yellowstone Park, up north.
So that's the south, almost the southeastern corner of the district at the time. And Yak being the northwestern. And you walked that entire distance.
I remember talking to Mike Mansfield about it, and I said I might walk up to the Yak, and asked him, what do you think? What does he think about that? And he said, yep. He says,
yep.
He says, yep. He says, put Yak on the map. That's a good idea. So did. No, yeah, I like being out. Like all Montanans. We like the outdoors. And I very much like to be out of doors. I like to hike. I like to fish. I like to ski. I just like the out of doors. I'm running this morning, for example. I just like being out of doors. And frankly, I like walking out of doors and hiking and so forth. So it just seemed natural to walk across Montana at that time. Because when you're walking too, not only out of doors, which I like, what more beautiful state is there to be out of doors in than the state of Montana, but also you tend to meet people that you otherwise wouldn't meet. Otherwise, I'd be going to meetings, political rallies, and so forth. It'd be the same kind of people.
Round up the usual people.
The usual people all the time. And I know the usual folks. I want to meet new folks. I want to meet people who just aren't part of political organizations. And so by walking, I was able to do so, and people would stop and we'd talk, and the rules I set up were that I had to walk every step of the way, and I did. But sometimes somebody would try to entice me to get in the car and drive up a little bit. Said,
just cheat a little. Just a little.
No, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. But it was, it meant an awful lot to me to be able to see people at that level.
By the way, it was amazing. Again, I was executive director of the party and observing the processes at that time. And but when we go back and look at the, I mean, in today's world, to look at what it cost to run for Congress in those days.
Yeah, well, that's true.
My recollection is I think your primary was about a $22,000 primary or something like that. I mean, and
well, as that's right, as inexpensive, and as that points obviously to another major Problem today is that's all the money in politics today. But back then, there's a lot less money.
Yeah. So this people connection thing meant a lot more. You were speaking more through eyeball-to-eyeball contact, even though you did run ads and stuff. I mean, your primary contact was direct with people.
Right. And, I mean, you know, we're lucky too in Montana because we're, excuse the expression, we're a retail state. We're not a wholesale state. That is, in Montana, you tend to get elected or unelected on a personal basis. Either like you personally or don't like you personally. Whereas in much larger state, California, New York, or something, a wholesale state, it's TV, it's media and so forth. You don't meet people personally. But we're lucky in Montana that we get to connect personally.
Well, you know, I mean, the symbol of that, I think, is that the citizens think of their elected officials as people they really know, and they do. They call them by their first name. I always think about it. It always was Mike.
That's right.
It was Lee.
That's right.
It is Max.
True.
It was Pat.
Right.
And so on and so forth.
Right.
That.
Oh, it's great. That's one of the great features of our state. We're egalitarian, we Montanans. We don't like people who put on airs. In Montana, if you put on airs, we take that person down pretty quickly.
We'd have our own deflate gate with that.
We don't like people putting on airs. We like people to be people.
Yeah.
And it's true on the airplane. Go back to D.C. It's, hey Max, you straighten those guys up back there, and it's not Senator, and it's always Max, and I like that a lot.
Yeah. Well, I think that closeness is unique to Montana. As you said, we're like a small town with really long streets. We all seem to know each other, and by the way, the immenseness you talked about of Montana, how big it is and how beautiful it is. When they say big sky, we're talking about a lot of sky. That if you actually took the state of Montana and you laid it on the map in eastern United States, if you took the northwest corner of Montana and put it on Chicago, the southeast corner of Montana would touch Baltimore. And it's hard for people to realize how immense we are, but you discovered that walking.
Yep.
Yeah. You know, and that was only half the state, or even less than half the state back then. You didn't stop that. That wasn't the only time you walked. You walked later the whole state.
That's right, but it wasn't as much fun.
Yeah.
The first time was a lot more fun.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing and I'm jump ahead here before that you did that tended to connect you to the real world and to people throughout your career was the job days that you did, where you actually came out and performed, spent a day working a job of a regular person to keep your feet on the ground, so to speak. That was a pretty real thing with you, wasn't it?
Oh, I loved it. It was very important to me. I think it was about 100 different times during over a number of years. Yeah, I'd show up at 8 o'clock in the morning with my sack lunch, and I was there to work all day, not watch, but to work, physical work. And during the lunch break, we'd have lunch, and guys and gals, and keep working. I liked it a lot. When I'd show up at 8 o'clock, you know, a lot of guys and gals say, man, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? Can come work with us. But after a while, they realize, you know, after I, you know, got fouled, you know, botched something up, made a big mistake, and hit my hammer or so forth, and as a real person, and then we have lunch, and then they ask me a lot of good, often very good, tough questions.
Yeah.
I learned so much at those lunch breaks. People these are basic, ordinary, wonderful people ask me just questions, raw questions that were on their mind. They would not have that opportunity to otherwise ask. And it's very, very important to me.
Well, it's such an important part of, if you think that the empowerment of people, so many people in the political world think it's about them as opposed to about the people. And clearly you were, in that second category big time. I want to remove this picture and replace it with this one. This is perhaps one of the more memorable campaign photos I have ever seen in my 40-some years in the political world. Just taking a look at that. You were walking for Congress for sure in not the best weather always. But tell us about that.
Well, that was the first day.
The first day?
The first day. Yeah, I got up early in the morning, gardener, started walking, overcast day. Lo and behold, a blizzard came up. And it was more of a squall. It didn't last terribly long. But it hit pretty hard for about half hour or so, and right middle of it. And then eventually made it up to the camper. I had a camper ahead of me. That's where I spent the night. It was always be a couple miles ahead of me. And have my name, Max, big letters, MAX on the side of the camper. Parked on the side so people driving on the highway have some idea who this nut is walking down the highway.
Yeah.
And anyway, that was the first day. And it's the thing, once you start something, you finish. And I thought, well, it's going to get better. It's not going to get worse. That is the weather.
Now, that photo is so dramatic. I always thought it was very helpful.
Well, I don't think it was helpful.
Don't you?
No, because it wasn't published in Montana. That photo appeared in papers all across the country. But the Montana papers didn't pick it up.
They didn't.
No.
Did you, when you're in the middle of that squall, did you think, is this a good idea? Or
No. I knew. No. It's just a bump in the road.
Yeah.
I knew I wanted to run for Congress.
Yeah.
I wanted to represent, people in Congress. So no, that was just a little incident.
So you had a primary, and then if you walked all the way to Yak, and you did all the way. When the primary was done, you were clearly the winner of that primary.
Right.
Then you had to run a general.
Right.
In between the primary and the general, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned.
Yeah.
It clearly there was big bad stuff going on in Washington D.C. that kind of dovetailed with your people orientation as a person. Tell us about that.
Well, to be honest, I was a little naive. I wanted to represent Montana, and so I worked hard to meet people, explain why I thought I'd be the better person for that job. And I remember driving in my little car, a little red Beetle, and I was listening to President Nixon resign. It was during Watergate, and it just a little blip in my mind. And, oh, this is interesting. It didn't really dawn on me. I was so naive at the time that this might have a positive effect on my getting elected. That is, there might be revulsion. The people getting so revolted with Watergate and Washington and so forth, and maybe that'll tend to encourage voters to sweep the old guys out and put new guys in. It didn't really dawn on me very much. But frankly, later on, that Watergate election had a very big effect on opening up the Congress. I can go in great detail.
A huge number of people elected new that year.
Right.
So it did have a sweeping effect.
Well, it had a huge effect, and had not only in lots of practical ways. For example, when I arrived, all the new members that got recently elected were talking to committee chairman, and the usual process was the committee chairman would interview the new members to see whether you could be on that chairman's committee or not. We turned the tables. We interviewed the chairman. And I remember one meeting, a bunch of us were talking to one fellow who wanted to continue to be chairman of one of the committees. And I remember thinking, this guy's not up to it. He should not be chairman of that committee, even though he's an old member of Congress, been there for umpteen years.
Seniority having meant everything to that point.
Exactly. And so I had to leave early. Frankly, I had to go to a funeral. And as I walked out, Roger Mudd, who was a major newscaster back then, asked me, well, Congressman, says, what do you think of that fellow? Should he be re-elected chairman? I said, no, he's not up to it. He said, are you willing to say that in the camera? I said, sure. And so did. And he was booted out. He did not get reelected. With just an example of Watergate and that period when newly elected members of Congress were changing the way Congress operated, changing it more to a way where the process was much more open than it was in the past. Another example, there was after I was there about, I don't know, several months or something, I had some free time, so I thought I'd go to watch a conference on a big tax bill. I could learn something. I could learn about tax policy, and I could learn between the House and the Senate. Senate conferees are meeting with the House conferees on this big tax bill. Well, I tried to find out where they're meeting, and I couldn't find it. It was secret, and
just the opposite of what we did with our Constitution
exactly.
in Montana.
Well, that influenced me. That's wrong that should be a secret. So I walked, asked around, where are they meeting? Nobody knew. Well, I know somebody who might know. It was Mike Mansfield's office. So I called Senator Mansfield's office, and they found out where the meeting was. So I went over to the meeting, and there was a policeman standing on the door, and he wouldn't let me in. And I was a bit disingenuous. I said, well, I'm a member, rationalizing a member of Congress, but
hoping he'd think you were a member of the committee.
Of the committee. We let me in. Yeah. And there's a bunch of people in there, executive branch people, and I took a seat way out in the corner just to watch, and after a while somebody walked up to me. His name was Jimmy Burke. He's a member of the House from Massachusetts. He said, I got to leave. And I said, why do I have to leave? He says, well, this is secret. And he said, no, this is closed. I said, what do you mean it's closed? He said, that's the rules. So I asked, well, what rules? He said, well, they're the Senate rules. I said, what Senate rule? And he didn't have an answer, but I said, okay, I'll leave. I'm not going to cause a fuss here, but this is wrong, and I'm going to do something about this. And so that next day, Congressman Ab Vickman and myself stood up on the House floor, and we said, hey, these should not be closed. These conferences should be open to the public, and we got the rules changed.
Well, it took from a little bit of Montana back to Washington,
right,
in that way.
Right.
Let me put up another picture here, which was when you were first back there, because this was in 1970, late 75 or early 76.
Yeah.
We have you,
right. That's
Eastern District Congressman at the time, John Melcher,
correct.
later Senator.
Right.
Senator Mike Mansfield and Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield,
correct.
and Senator Lee Metcalf.
Correct.
You're all holding an American flag
Yeah.
with the Capitol Dome behind you.
Right.
Without focusing on the picture, give me a few comments about those three gentlemen that you were able to work with.
Well, they're all Montanans, all very different,
Yeah.
but all Montanans. They're just very, very good people. I have high regard for each of the three.
Yeah. Now, people say that if there was somebody who was a mentor for you, it would have been Mike.
That's true.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I've heard about Mike Mansfield a lot when I was younger. There's just something about his style, his statesmanship, his demeanor, his fairness, his openness. He's a man of few words. It didn't take himself seriously at all, and his fairness. He would often say, he once, in fact, before he died, he was talking to a bunch of students, and he said, "I remember, you're not, the other guy is not always wrong, and you're not always right." It was a hallmark of Mike. He put yourself in the other guy's shoes and see the world how he sees it or she sees it, so that you can reach some kind of an accommodation. That was very much Mike. Also, he always ended the meeting, as you know, with that wonderful phrase, "Tap or light."
Tap or light.
And that was to me his way of saying, keep cool, keep calm. It's moderation. Just don't get too wrapped around the axle. We're working together. You have to get solutions here. You need to get results, and that was very much Mike.
No matter where he was, your conversation always ended with tap or light.
That's
I always
correct.
remember he used to, and I would meet him at the offices when he was
Right.
Goldman Sachs offices, and he would escort you right to the elevator.
That's right.
And as the elevator door was closing, Mike would say, "Tap or light."
Yeah, though I went to see him at Walter Reed Hospital before he died. Those were his last words to me.
Yeah. And interestingly, by the way, and a bit of a parallel, if you will, of some note, is that when he stopped being senator, he became the ambassador to our the biggest economic entity in Asia at the time, Japan. And when you've stepped out of the Senate now, you've become the ambassador to China. How do you feel about that?
Oh, it's an awesome responsibility. I feel very honored. President Obama called me up at halftime, the Cat Grizzly game, a year and a half ago, and I was stunned, ecstatic. It's almost a life's dream. Why? Because this relationship, U.S.-China, is the most important relationship in the world at this point. This is historic, and we've got to get this relationship right. The United States is the largest economy, established power. China, a rising power, the second largest economy, two very different cultures. And when these two cultures and two economies meet, we've got to make sure that they meet in a good, solid way, not in a disastrous way. And so I feel very honored to have this responsibility, and very honored that in some way, kind of in a parallel with Mike, no one's going to have the stature of Mike Mansfield, but you know, his first choice was to be ambassador to China. That was already taken, so he then became ambassador to
Remember,
Japan.
of course, his nickname when he was professor at the university was China Mike.
That's true.
Yeah.
It was. I read a speech by him recently. It was given in 1968. It was very, very far-sighted, prescient. It was amazing about the role of China in the world. And he was a very wise man. Of course, he taught East Asian history at the university, but he's a very wise man. That's another reason he meant so much to me. I could just sense, even as a younger person, that China is going to be very important to our lives, and it is becoming even more important than I then realized.
A parallel, when you talk about the way you spent your political career essentially being part of this empowerment of people, and when you think about Mike's roots, being in the underground mines in Butte, and Marine getting him educated, and him ending up a congressman and a senator. Pretty amazing. Well, a couple parting, we're about ready to wrap up. I told you this hour would go by very fast. A quick reflection on this period, the early 70s. Oh. Did it stick with you?
Oh yeah. Well, it's my impressions of that time in our state's history we were very, very lucky that we at that time came together and wrote a very solid, progressive Constitution, and that period meant an awful lot to me, and it still does to this day, it's you know, you treasure some of those moments. That's a moment I treasure very much.
Mm-hmm. Legislature set you on your way then, and
Sorry?
The legislature then set you on your way to electoral politics.
Right.
You seem to have found your home in that, and you spent your life representing people. Well, we're going to wrap up here. I want to tell you, Max, how much I appreciate your coming here and being part of In the Crucible of Change, because you were part of it when it happened. Your presence here, I think, speaks to the seriousness of our endeavor to try to convey this wonderful story of progressive change in Montana to generations looking forward, and folks who maybe don't recognize what a strong people-oriented state we have in this state. And so you've been a really big part of that with the CONCON, with the legislature, and then representing us in Congress. So thank you so much for coming and joining us in the Crucible of Change.
Well, you bet, Evan, and thanks for putting this program on. Okay. It's a great service.
Great. So it's been such a great pleasure to have Senator Ambassador Baucus with us and take part in looking at this progressive era of change. So thanks for joining us, Max, and thank you for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next program.